Local 514's host Savannah Craig sat down with Gavin Armitage to discuss the current housing shortage in Montreal. Craig and Armitage discussed methods of raising rent and the profit made by some landlords through the housing market. To hear more on the subject, stay tuned for the whole interview.
So could you tell me what tactics outside of the legal method of raising rent yearly under the TAL's recommended percentage, are landlords using in order to make more money off of their units?
Yeah, it's a good question. So Quebec has sort of a unique rent control system. It's more of a rent arbitration system. Um, so the one key defining feature of the way that the system works is that um, rent controls, so such as the ones you recommended by the TAL, they don't hold between leaseholders, which is really key to how it all works. That's what landlords really go after to try to raise the rents. So if you're paying $1,000 and then end up leaving an apartment, the next person won't be subject to the same 2.3% increase potentially. There's no limits between tenants. Um, the major thing that helps landlords do that is that a lot of us just aren't familiar with their rights. They're not familiar with how the system works. So they're able to potentially coerce renters by maybe sometimes lying to them or just outright confusing them. For example, there's people that may not even know how the rent arbitration system works. So suddenly they complain, they go, I'm upset my landlord just increased my rent by $200 and I don't know what to do about it. And they end up just accepting it, not even realizing that they can actually, go to the tribunal and contest that. So they'll take advantage of that. A really great example of that is actually that people don't know this, but landlords are actually supposed to show you the highest paid rent within the last year on a unit. So, again, let's say you pay $1,000 and move out and I move in and I'm paying 1,300. Maybe I know you and you give me a copy of your lease and I go to the tribunal and I say, well, the landlord didn't tell me, but he raised my rent $300 instead of the recommended amount, and I can contest that. But obviously, a lot of people aren't aware of that fact. And landlords, I have never heard of an example where a landlord would willingly go up to you and say, hey, just so you know, here's the highest rent that the last tenant paid, but I'm charging you $300 more, right? It's not going to happen. So they'll do that type of thing. They might even try sort of abusive measures. They'll either lie or coerce you to try to evict you. I know that in Park Extension since 2017, there's been like over 120 evictions just in that one neighborhood alone. And it's usually in neighborhoods that have like Park X, that have a high proportion of low income renters and a high immigrant population. Usually the most vulnerable, again, people that aren't going to be as familiar with the system. I've even heard stories of where landlords, it's usually what you call like a numbered company, a numbered landlord. So it's just a random speculator who comes in, buys a building, and they have so much money to invest in real estate that they'll just go up and they'll say, we want to, maybe they want to flip the building or they want to renovate it and sell it for more, demolish it, who knows? They'll just go up to the tenants and go, I'll offer you 20 grand on the spot to just leave and evict the premises. So they'll even kind of stoop to that depending on how much money they have and their resources. And then lastly, I'd say the big one is there are just certain loopholes that they'll abuse. Loopholes that might be fine. For example, there's a rule that allows a landlord to evict you if they or a family member would like to move into the unit, but the city rarely can properly enforce this. It's the same with what's called, I'm sure you've probably heard of rent evictions, which is a big one. So obviously, you can evict a tenant if you're going to be undergoing, necessary or major renovations. Obviously, this oftentimes leads to landlords purposely allowing buildings to deteriorate with the hopes of, okay, I'm going to allow it to deteriorate for the next 10 years, and then eventually I'll go, oh, got to evict all the tenants and increase all the rents and renovate it. So that happens, but really the crux of the matter is that you can evict them to renovate it, and the city has no real way of actually verifying this. It's actually the province's job to ensure the integrity of a renovation. So, you can basically get a renovation permit and then that's it. The city may not be able to follow up. It's just not their jurisdiction. So all of this really is just, the goal is that if a landlord wants to, increase rents as much as they can, they're going to find any way to just get the current leaseholder out, and suddenly all these doors open to increase it. The one last thing I would also mention, we're talking mostly here about residential units, like tenants, or residential tenants. But another really big one actually is commercial spaces. Like commercial spaces, there's actually no limit on how high that you can increase the rent for a commercial unit ever. So like you might just be paying $1,000 and suddenly a new landlord comes in and raises your rent to $3,000, and there's actually nothing you can do about it, which is a really big issue because this isn't just like Starbucks and McDonald's getting their rent increase. It's like you may have a neighborhood like Mile End where you had one corporate landlord come in and they bought up the vast majority of all the commercial properties on the strip, and they just functionally evicted almost every single family-owned business on the entire street and replaced them with chains or higher end buildings. And because of this, you end up, you may lose out on really important community spaces. It's not just going to be, like I said, like chain places getting their rents increased. It could be a co-op. It could be important like local cultural space for a local immigrant group per se. So it's really problematic for sure.
That's horrifying.
Yeah, it's really intense. It's terrible.
I didn't know about that.
Wow. Yeah, I think it's something that's not really talked about as much because obviously we know about like renters experience like residents. Every renter in Montreal's probably had a story of a really terrible landlord. I know I have. I currently live in a dilapidated apartment, and the landlord's just totally absent. But these commercial spaces, it's like that's like the life of the community. It's really terrible. People like you'll have a family-owned business that's been there for 40 years in the community that's been like serving a particular demographic, and it's been an important meeting space, and suddenly literally within 1 month their entire lives are ruined, and now it's replaced with a Lululemon or something. So it's depressing.
It is. I wanted to double check something you said. So you mentioned about, you used the example of a landlord raising in between a lease $300, for example, and that you said that a new tenant can go to the TAL and contest this. So does this mean they can contest it to abide by, whatever the TAL recommends as a legal percentage of raising the rent from the last lease?
Yeah, exactly. And there's very strict rules. There's a strict time frame around it. I can't remember exactly what it is because there's different time frames for like you have to request it, and then I think it's like this like something like a grace period of 3 months or something. Don't quote me on that, but it says on the landlord or on the lease. It's interesting if you look through your lease, there's actually a section dedicated that's actually supposed to have the written rent, the highest rent from the last 12 months. And like, for example, I checked mine as soon as I found this out, and of course it's empty. but then there's a box right next to it that tells you exactly the time frame in which you can contest it. And yes, it would be, let's say, he had raised it $300. Then you go to the TIL and you say, well, your recommendation was actually 2.5% or whatever, and they'll adjust it accordingly. But yeah, I mean, a lot of people just don't know it because obviously no landlord's going to tell you, because they want to have more money. And I can't imagine you going to a landlord and saying, hey, I'd like to rent your apartment. What was the highest rent paid within the last 12 months? Of course, they're just going to go, not interested. I'm going to go find another tenant that doesn't ask me that question. So
Yeah. Yeah.
it's tough. We have a pretty, like, we're really lucky in a lot of ways. Like compared to Alberta per se, there's no rent control of any kind. And there's stories of people in Alberta who have their rent increased literally 25% overnight. And and it could be like elderly residents who just don't have any money and they have nowhere else to go. Luckily, we don't have it quite like that here, but there is a huge onus on the tenant. Like the government is not going to enforce these things unless the tenant specifically knows their rights and is educated on the issue, has the resources to actually go to court, and fight this thing out. Like, I mean, it's exhausting, especially against a very big landlord. So
I always laugh when I think of this. I mean, it's so bad, but my last landlord, when I would assert my rights, he would go out on the street and cry in front of the neighbors.
that's just like embarrassing.
It is, it's so manipulative. And I'm like,
it is.
you're 45. And I was like 25 at the time. I'm like, come on, get your shit together.
That's one of the weirder ones I've heard for sure.
It
Like
is.
my landlord, his go-to thing is he just says, well, I don't want to sue you, or, oh, I don't want to have to go to court over this. And that's his type of thing, or he'll show up at a very inopportune time. Like he's shown up and knocked on the door at 9:30 p.m. on like a Wednesday, and you go boom, boom, boom. You like walk over to the door and suddenly he's hitting you with a million different things and you don't know how to react. And then he goes, well, they try to strong arm you. Oh, I don't want to bring you to court. That wouldn't be very good, right? Like you wouldn't want to go to court against me. So at some point you just have to it's tough when people don't know their rights and don't know, they can't stand up for themselves. So
And then that's illegal too, because he didn't give you 24 hours notice.
yeah, my landlord never gives me 24-hour notice. And also my landlord uses post-dated checks, which is technically illegal. But that's the way it goes. I live in a cheap, dilapidated apartment, and
It's kind of like you have to pick your battles. Like, what are the illegal things they do I can put up with in order for me to have like an affordable place to live?
yeah, those things have never been a problem for me. It's more that he just, our front door has been broken for literally I think 3 years. There's a photo of an article and it's like gentrification in Mile End, and these apartments are being left to decay and blah 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 blah. And the photo at the top of the article is literally my apartment with the broken front door, and that's like 2 years ago, and it's still not fixed.
Can I use that?
Yeah, yeah, of course.
I'm so sorry to laugh, but it's
No,
just so ridiculous.
it is ridiculous. He'll send a guy to come fix the door, and the guy comes and fiddles around with it for 5 minutes and then leaves, and it's broken 2 days later. I can try to find the article and send it to you afterwards.
Yeah, if it's not too much trouble. Oh my goodness, I'm
Yeah.
so sorry.
Yeah, it's, again, I mean, pick your battles. It's like I get the cheap rent, so I'm like, whatever. Broken front door, I guess I'll live with it.
Oh my goodness. And then so I know that you've already started to discuss this. One thing that I didn't add in the questions that I am curious if you're willing to answer is kind of like this tactic of when you are paying cheap rent, like, how do I ask this? I'm trying to get at like, or what do you think of what do you think of, or what have you seen in terms of landlords who may not provide more well-known ways of illegal tactics, such as like rent evictions or just imposing an increase in any way, but kind of do things like, you know, not making necessary repairs and things like this? Do you think that that's prevalent in what you've seen in Montreal?
I think it's pretty prevalent, especially because Montreal is a very old housing stock. I don't have any numbers on that at the moment, but definitely in particular, like I know that in Park Extension, a lot of the time it's, again, Park Extension is a really great example for Montreal because it is one of the lowest income communities and it has a very high immigrant population. And it's also I think it's about 88% of residents in Park Extension are actually renters. So it's really the perfect sort of example of a lot of this stuff. There is a very high percentage of units in Park Extension that are dilapidated and in need of major repairs. It's like double the average of the rest of the city, nearing 10%, I believe. But and it's no surprise that, you know, at the same time, it's also seeing a lot of evictions in that neighborhood, like a record amount. Across Montreal too, there's a record amount, but particularly in that neighborhood, they're very highly concentrated. Um, I mean, I gave a number of about 120, but that's actually only the ones that we know about. Like, there actually could be many more evictions that we will never hear about because they're not being tracked, and it requires independent verification. It requires journalists or researchers to go in themselves and just talk to residents. That's literally the only way. But yeah, so but to get back to your question, yeah, it is especially in Montreal. It's definitely quite prevalent.
Thank you for answering that. So I wanted to ask, how do homeowners owning multiple properties affect renters and the rental market in Montreal? And if there's anything you want to say about Canada?
Yeah, well, I guess it's sort of two different questions, right? Because it's like you can have homeowners that are, you know, may have an extra rental property that they buy as an investment or whatever, and you know, that's one thing. Somebody owning, you know, your grandparents owning an extra rental unit, it's not really hurting anybody. That's not really affecting the market. But what is happening is that among like a very particular wealthy group of investors, a particular class of people, are, you know, buying many properties all at once. And the issue with that is that it might even be, you know, like I know that in Vancouver, for example, about 10% of all the housing is currently owned by corporations. And 10% may not seem like a ton, but you know, when you have that amount of homes owned by investors in a single place or across the country, um, what happens is you obviously have this short-term house flipping, and constant resales, and you have a small group that are basically taking a pretty sizable chunk of housing and just using it to rapidly increase the price. Like the whole housing market is obviously based off speculation. If you want to sell your own home, you go, okay, what are the prices like nearby and how much could I sell my home for? And they're doing the same thing. You have a very small amount of transactions that are rapidly increasing the price of housing, which obviously has a bad effect on renters. Um, but I mean, to give you an example, like I don't have any numbers on Montreal specifically, but you could assume that it's quite similar. I know that in Vancouver, investors own basically 1 in 4 of every house. Like a quarter of the entire housing supply in Vancouver is owned by investors. And for recent builds since 2016, it's actually almost double. It's 44% of the entire supply of new housing is instantly being purchased by investors. it's also a reason why, and this is another kind of complicated issue, but the vast majority of housing that's being built is just condominiums. It's just condos now, because that stuff makes the most money, and gets the highest returns. And yeah, and so then again, it's like, like I think in the last year alone, rents for new tenants, so that'd be like, like the example I gave of a new tenant taking over a previous place and the landlords raised the rent and whatever. The average rent went up 18% across Canada last year, which is quite a lot. And that includes newly built units and also just older units taking on new tenants. Yeah, it's really just when you concentrate housing in the hands of a small group of people, that are trying to extract as much value and profit out of it, it just spirals the whole housing market, and it's self-fulfilling because it's, you sell it at a high cost and then somebody else sees, oh, I want to get in on that, and now you have all these rich people that are constantly flipping the houses. Yeah, and there's certain issues too where when you concentrate many homes in the hands of a small amount of landlords or investors, it's also it's a issue as well, right? Like large landlords who are only in it for the money, they're going to have more resources to combat their tenants and evict them and raise rents. And it can be very exhausting to try to combat a very well-equipped large landlord. There's also a big chance that they will just allow your building to become neglected, like that's happening a lot in Toronto. So it becomes an issue of democracy where tenants are too far distant from their landlord. The landlord, it might just be some international conglomerate and whatever. So landlords become more unaccountable, and they end up making very big decisions that affect a lot of people at once. I don't know. I don't want to go over time here. I know you said you had a meeting at 1:30.
I pushed it back a bit, so it's okay.
Okay, cool. Well, I was going to say another, like on the issue of a very small amount of wealthy people kind of, concentrating the home ownership. A perfect example of that is Airbnb. We just had there's a terrible story last week about an Airbnb in the old port of Montreal that caught fire under suspicious circumstances and whatever, and really terrible stuff. But what's happening is that you have, again, Airbnb's short-term rentals, they're very hard to regulate and track down. And so you have a lot of people coming in and buying a lot of properties and just immediately converting them into Airbnbs, and just immediately that just takes them right off the market. In Montreal, there's about, from what I have seen, there's about 12,000 Airbnb listings at any given moment. And it's been estimated by a researcher, actually one of my professors here at McGill, that at least 6,000 of these are full-time listings that are fully removed from the market. So, and while this might not seem like a lot in like the grand scheme of the whole city, a lot of the times it ends up being concentrated in a particular neighborhood, and so it puts on extra pressure. I mean, even if, let's say, 2% of all the housing in a neighborhood is now Airbnbs, you might think, well, it's 2%. How significant could that be? Well, that's what the vacancy rate is. Like that's our wiggle room. Like if you want to have a functioning housing market where you can actually distribute houses properly, for competitive, cheaper prices, we have 2% of the housing market does that for us. So you just take that many houses off the market, and that's it. It's, so yeah, I mean, really just however way you cut it, concentrating the ownership of housing into a very small group of people, it's just not good. I mean, it really just tells us that housing is being treated as an investment and a profit-making tool rather than a human right, and it's just going to continue doing that unless we step in a significant way. Yeah.
Sorry, I was just taking notes. Is your professor David Washsmith?
Yes.
Yeah, I've interviewed him.
He's great. I mean, he's the Airbnb guy, 100%. Like that's the thing about Airbnbs, like, apparently like 95% of all Airbnbs are just not even licensed in Quebec. And it's just impossible to track them down. We have all these rules, but like it just does not get enforced. Um, I talked to a borough planner in Park Extension actually while I was doing some work there, and he told me that there's only about 10 or 11 people in the entire province who are in charge of regulating Airbnbs, which is just insane because I think it's been estimated that there are like 100,000 Airbnbs in Quebec. So
Yeah, I covered this last summer. That's when I interviewed him. And
mhm.
honestly, doesn't seem like anything's changed. And I think because there's so little inspectors kind of holding illegal Airbnbs or at least finding them,
Mhm.
it's not going to change, I think.
Definitely not. Yeah, I mean, also just the um, what's the word? The what do you call it when you? It's not bribing. Like you just have all these landlord organizations that have so much power and influence. They lobby. They lobby the government. The landlord groups have so much sway, and they just lobby the hell out of the government to get whatever they want. So
I'm sorry. Um, is there anything specifically you could say about that in Montreal, like landlords having power within politics, either through connections or our politicians being landlords? That's kind of a
yeah,
curveball. So
no, it's a good question. I mean, I can't say much about Montreal in particular. Landlords definitely have quite a bit of sway, but I can't speak to any examples on that. But I do know that um, a major difficulty for sure is the fact that a lot of provincial and federal politicians are landlords, which is like a major roadblock. It's a completely disproportionate, obviously, too. Um, in Quebec, on the provincial level, um, I know that it's not quite as intense. I think right now it's about 11% of members of the National Assembly are landlords. I mean, 11% is still quite a bit, but it's not quite as intense. But on the federal level, 38% of federal MPs are landlords. And in Quebec, 27% of all federal MPs in Quebec are landlords as well. So, I did a piece a while back where I was looking and comparing the, federal and provincial housing plans. And it's not really a surprise when you go through that pretty much all they care about is just how can we get more people into the market? That's really like the crux of every single federal and provincial housing plan in the last few years. It's just how can we help first-time home buyers get into a market that's already overheated, which does not really do much to, I mean, especially does not help renters who are a huge proportion of the population. But they want those votes from homeowners, so that's what and they're landlords themselves, so they're going to do things that help landlords.
Thank you. So I wanted to bring up the City of Toronto announced the vacant home tax for homeowners paying their 2022 taxes. It's essentially a 1% tax on the current value assessment for all Toronto residences that have been determined vacant for more than 6 months during the last year. Do you think something like this should be implemented in Montreal to prevent the hoarding of housing?
Um, yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I think whether or not it's actually effective in doing that in preventing the hoarding of housing, I'd say it's questionable. I mean, most of the data that I've seen out of Vancouver and Toronto has either been inconclusive about it, again, because housing is such a difficult thing to track. So it's been either inconclusive, or most of the more conclusive results have said it doesn't really have an effect. I mean, having a 1% tax on vacant units, I mean, if you can get extra money and put that money towards more progressive causes, maybe say the social housing, or um, benefits and subsidies to help renters, or something like that, or like a sort of a rent bank, or all sorts of things. You could take that money and put it into that, but it probably won't affect the actual concentration of housing. And really the reason for that is just that I mean, if you are so rich that you can afford to just buy multiple homes and then hold on to them and have them completely vacant, a 1% tax on that isn't really going to discourage you. It may discourage maybe, let's say, more small time investors, maybe people who own one home or two homes tops, like apartments per se, and are just leaving them vacant, and they don't have all those resources to just hold out. But if you have multinational corporations or major international coming into Vancouver and buying 44% of all the new housing, yeah, they're probably got enough money to outlast it. So yeah, worth pursuing. But what worries me about things like that is that politicians and the government are able to pass them off as solutions, and say they can point to that and say, see, look at all the work we've done. We put a 1% tax on those speculators. We're putting our foot down. And then the speculators are basically, I mean, the speculators can pay the money, and then the price of their house is going to go up so much that they can just sell the house and make so much money that it completely offsets any tax that they have to pay on it. So
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
yeah.
Is there anything that I didn't ask that you think is important to consider or you'd like to share?
Let's see. I think we honestly touched on a lot of stuff. So I'm not sure. I mean, if you have any other like random little questions you want to ask, I can try to answer them the best I can.
Honestly, I think we got through more than I even expected to. So yeah, you're very, very thorough, and I really appreciate all your information.
Yeah, no problem.